What if I told you a wild bobcat once walked into a funeral and left the entire town in tears? Not from fear, but from something far deeper. No one could explain how he found the place. No one expected what he did next. But the truth began many years ago, with a lonely man in the mountains. Ash, the bobcat who came back. If you're listening to this story right now, drop a comment and tell us where you're tuning in from. We'd love to know where this journey is reaching hearts. Up in the remote ridges of Colorado's San Juan Mountains lived a man no one truly understood. His name was Walter Granger, a retired firefighter who had lost everything: his wife, his son, and nearly himself. He lived alone in a wooden cabin by the tree line, where the wind carried more memories than words, and where fate, one winter, would send him a companion he never expected. A wild creature with wounded paws and a soul that remembered. The wind bit harder than usual that January afternoon. Snow dusted the bare branches like forgotten letters, and the evergreens stood in solemn silence as if mourning something unseen. Up in the ridgelines of the San Juan Mountains, south of Telluride, Colorado, winter was less a season and more a reckoning. At an elevation where silence reigned and roads gave way to trails, stood a weather-worn log cabin built half a century ago, its cedar beams groaning softly with the weight of snow and time. Walter Granger lived there, alone. He was 72, a tall man with the posture of someone who once carried others out of burning buildings and now carried only memories. His thick, weathered hands showed remnants of past burns and decades of calluses. His face, partially hidden beneath a silver beard, was deeply lineage-etched by grief more than age. His eyes, once piercing blue, had faded into the color of ash and often looked through things rather than at them. Walter was a retired firefighter, the kind who never spoke of heroism, only of routines and fire drills, of broken windows and broken hearts. The town of Ridgway knew his name, but had long since stopped knocking on his door. Walter had not always been this way. 20 years ago, he had a wife, Helen, and a son named Joshua. A tragic highway accident during a snowstorm had taken them both. Since then, the cabin had become his refuge, and the forest his only companion. He had a wood stove, a faded photograph of his family on the mantel, and a single rocking chair that creaked like an old friend. He rarely ventured to town, only when he absolutely had to. His nearest neighbor, Ruth Chambers, was a widow in her late 60s, with a crown of white curls and a reputation for being both nosy and kind. She had once been an ER nurse, and though her hands trembled now, her voice never did. Walter didn't mind Ruth. She came by every few weeks with extra bread or a bottle of her husband's old scotch, just to check if he was still breathing, as she'd often joke. She wore a patchwork coat sewn by her granddaughter and smelled faintly of cinnamon and antiseptic. Ruth never asked about Helen or Joshua. She knew better. She simply talked to him like he was still part of the world. It was during one of his long walks in the woods, on a gray, biting afternoon, that Walter first saw the creature. He had been following the ridge toward an old frozen stream, checking snares that some unethical hunters still left behind despite posted warnings. There, half buried in the snow, was a crude steel trap. Inside, a bobcat. Barely more than a kitten, no older than 6 months, its fur was matted with blood, where the cruel metal teeth had caught its front leg. Its breath came in shallow, frightened huffs. The creature's golden eyes, wide with pain and fury, locked onto Walter like it expected death to come in the shape of a man. Walter crouched slowly, the snow crunching beneath his boots. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse but low, almost soothing. The bobcat hissed weakly. Its body trembled from cold and blood loss. He looked around. No signs of hunters, no signs of a mother bobcat, no choice. With gloved hands, he pried the trap open. The bobcat yelped, twisting in pain. Walter gently wrapped it in his coat, ignoring the shallow swipe it managed with its free paw. Blood soaked into the flannel lining, It would scar, but it didn't matter. He tucked the small, wild thing close to his chest and began the slow, trudging walk back to the cabin, muttering half-prayers to no one and everyone. That night, Walter laid the bobcat on a wool blanket beside the fire, dabbing its wound with warm water and iodine. He'd named it before he even realized, Ash. Not just for the color of its fur, a dusky mix of gray and brown, but because it reminded him of something once burned, now barely glowing, but not yet gone. Ash growled through its pain, its ears twitching with every movement, but didn't bite. Not again. For the next several days, Walter nursed Ash with the same precision and patience he once used, tending fire victims. He fed it raw venison from his freezer, spoke to it in gruff, quiet tones, and sat with it through the long mountain nights. Sometimes, he read aloud from old firefighter manuals or books he never finished. Ash would lie there, blinking slowly, absorbing the strange rhythm of human presence. The pain in Ash's leg gradually subsided. It began standing, limping from one corner of the cabin to another, still wary, but no longer terrified. Walter never touched it unless necessary. Trust, he knew, wasn't something you demanded. It was earned over frostbitten days and whisper-thin nights. He never once considered turning the bobcat over to the authorities. He told himself it was temporary, just until it healed. But some part of him, part long, buried already, knew that Ash had walked into his life for more than just rescue. Out in the world, winter still raged. The snow thickened. The mountain pass closed for the season. But inside that worn wooden cabin, something quietly bloomed again. Not joy, not yet, but presence. Life, connection. The forest had given Walter Granger a second chance. And the bobcat, without knowing it, had just begun rewriting the final chapter of a lonely man's story. Ash's leg healed slowly, but the spirit within him remained sharp and wary. In the days that followed his rescue, the young bobcat would often curl up in a far corner of the cabin, his eyes never truly closing, always fixed on Walter's movements. The fire crackled in the wood stove, casting long, dancing shadows that made Ash twitch in his sleep, the primal instinct in him refusing to fully rest in the presence of a man. And yet, something began to shift. Walter, too, had changed. He no longer spent entire afternoons in silence. Instead, he found himself speaking to Ash not with commands, but with conversation, as if the bobcat were a long-lost friend who had simply forgotten how to answer. "You've got the same eyes as Helen's old tabby," he'd mutter while slicing venison or pouring a bowl of warm water. "But twice the fire." At night, he'd sit in the rocker with a tattered copy of The Old Man and the Sea, reading aloud with a voice that shook only slightly at the edges. Ash would lift his head at the sound, blinking slowly, ears angled like radar. Outside, the snow kept falling. February in the San Juan Mountains was unforgiving whiteout storms followed by brittle calm. Wind rattled the cabin windows like an old memory trying to get in. But inside, the air grew softer. Ash began creeping closer to the fire, inch by inch each day. One evening, he even brushed against Walter's boot before darting away like a ghost, startled by its own shadow. There was a rhythm now. At dawn, Walter would chop wood while Ash slinked along the edge of the tree line, tail low, sniffing rabbit tracks. At midday, the bobcat would nap in a sunbeam while Walter wrote letters he never sent to Joshua, one to Helen, another to nobody at all. He kept them in a drawer by the bed. And each evening, they shared a quiet dinner. Walter at the table, Ash at the hearth, the sounds of chewing and fire their only music. One morning, Ruth Chambers came knocking. She always knocked twice, first like a neighbor, second like a nurse. "You in there, Walter?" I brought apple bread, still warm. Ruth, bundled in her threadbare purple coat, stood barely 5'2" but radiated presence like a lighthouse in fog. Her eyes were the color of weak tea, kind but sharp. She didn't wait for an answer before nudging the door open. Her gaze immediately fell on the sleeping bobcat near the fire. She froze. Walter, standing at the stove, turned with a ladle in hand. Don't panic. That's a bobcat, Ruth whispered, setting the bread down slowly. I know, he replied, voice steady. His name's Ash. Ruth blinked, studied Walter's face. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for her phone. She simply looked at the bobcat, then back at Walter. You always did have a thing for lost causes, she said, and handed him the bread. Later, over coffee and firelight, she said nothing more about Ash. Just sipped slowly and stared out the window at the endless white. That was Ruth knew when to speak and when to let silence do the healing. Ash remained cautious with her. He didn't approach but didn't flee either. When she left, she gave Walter a long look. You can't keep him forever, Walt. You know that, right? Walter nodded. I know. But what he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that Ash was the first living being to make the silence bearable since the accident. The bobcat didn't try to fix him, didn't offer pity or prayer. He simply existed beside him, a creature of instinct and scar tissue, just like Walter. The days melted into each other like snowflakes on warm skin. Ash's limp faded. His gait grew stronger. He began climbing the shelves, perching atop the bookcase like a feline king. Walter laughed for the first time in years when Ash swatted a can of beans off the counter, then stared at it, stunned by the sound. At night, Ash would sometimes curl near Walter's boots, close enough to feel his warmth, but far enough to flee if needed. Still, Walter never reached out to pet him. He knew better. Ash wasn't a pet. He was a gift, wild and borrowed. And one day, nature would come calling. That spring, the snow began to loosen its grip. Pine needles re-emerged from the frost. Birds returned with songs that felt unfamiliar. Ash stood at the door longer now, staring at the forest with twitching ears. He sniffed the air like a creature remembering something vital. Walter noticed. He began leaving the door ajar more often. No words were exchanged. No goodbyes rehearsed. Just a quiet understanding hanging in the smoke-sweet air of the cabin. This would not last forever. But for now, for these final days of snow and fire, Walter and Ash lived not as man and beast, but as two survivors, tethered by the same quiet ache and the same unexpected grace. Spring came hesitantly to the San Juan Mountains. The snow melted in streaks, revealing patches of muddy earth and moss like forgotten notes in a song. Ash had grown stronger, sleeker, bolder. His once wounded leg no longer dragged. He leapt across the cabin rafters and sprinted through the clearing behind Walter's cabin with the grace of a born predator. Walter often watched him from the porch, coffee in hand, heart both full and trembling. He knew what was coming, though he never said it aloud. It happened on a Tuesday morning, a blue sky day with light wind teasing the spruce trees. Walter was stacking firewood beside the shed when he heard the distant rumble of an engine. Not Ruth, she walked. This was a truck. Within minutes, tires crunched over gravel, and a red pickup pulled into his clearing. The driver stepped out, tall and broad, a rifle slung casually over his shoulder. "Morning," the man called. "You Walter Granger?" Walter nodded slowly. "Who's asking?" "Name's Hank Miller. I hunt up here in the Fallock mostly. I was scoping trails yesterday when I saw a bobcat around your place. Figured I should let someone know. Ain't legal to keep one as a pet, you're aware." Hank was in his 40s, thick beard, aviator sunglasses, and a badge stitched on the shoulder of his camo vest volunteer wildlife tracker. His tone wasn't cruel, just blunt, like a man who thought laws were tools, not questions. "I don't keep pets," Walter said flatly, "and I didn't ask for visitors." "Sure, but when a wild animal gets too comfortable around people, it becomes dangerous. That bobcat could turn on you, or someone else." Walter narrowed his eyes. "He hasn't." The conversation ended there, but the visit had already cast a long shadow. The next morning, a black SUV arrived. From it stepped Officer Trina Caldwell, Colorado Division of Wildlife Enforcement. She was in her late 30s, olive-toned skin, jet black braid tucked neatly beneath her cap, clipboard in hand. She moved with authority, but her eyes showed no arrogance, just the weight of protocol. "Mr. Granger, we received a report about a wild animal being kept on private property. May I speak with you?" Walter stood in the doorway, unmoving. Ash, sensing something was off, slinked behind the woodpile and froze. Trina glanced toward the movement. "I'd like to be respectful, sir, but I do need to inspect the area." Walter didn't argue. He stepped aside. She saw Ash within moments calm, lean, muscles coiled beneath sleek fur. Not domesticated, not tame, but not hostile either. Just alert, present. Trina's face softened for a second. "Beautiful animal," she murmured. "He was injured. I helped him heal. That's all." "Mr. Granger, state law prohibits harboring wildlife without a license. Bobcats fall under protected classification. This is a potential safety concern. I'll have to report it." "He's not a threat," Walter said firmly. "He's family. I understand you feel that way, but feelings don't override wildlife regulations." As tension thickened, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Trina Caldwell, is that you?" Ruth Chambers emerged from the tree line, carrying her basket of canned peaches as if she'd just happened to be walking by. "Ruth?" Trina blinked. "I haven't seen you since my mother's surgery." "You still wear that braid like you're 12, Ruth smiled. Then she turned serious. "This man saved that animal. He didn't cage it, didn't train it. He just helped it survive. Same way he helped put out the fire on my porch back in '98. He's not breaking the spirit of the law." Trina hesitated. Ruth stepped closer. "Let him return the bobcat to the wild on his own terms. You and I both know forced relocation doesn't end well for animals like this." Trina studied Walter, then Ash, then Ruth. Finally, she sighed. "I'll file this as rehabilitation with release. But it has to be documented. The bobcat must be let go within the week. After that, if he's found on this property again—" "I understand," Walter said softly. As Trina left, Ruth remained, her hand on Walter's shoulder. "I bought you some extra lentils," she said. "Figured you'd need something to chew on." That night, Walter didn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at Ash curled by the fire. How do you explain to an animal that love must sometimes mean letting go? That kindness has boundaries set by those who've never looked into eyes like his? Ash blinked at him lazily, unaware of the storm rising just beyond the cabin walls. And Walter, old and aching, whispered into the still air, "You saved me, and I couldn't even return the favor properly." But the forest was calling, and the law had spoken. The morning arrived, cloaked in stillness, as if the forest itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Walter stood at the cabin window, steaming mug in hand, watching as Ash paced along the edge of the trees. The bobcat had grown restless over the past few days, his golden eyes turning frequently toward the woods, like a sailor feeling the pull of a forgotten sea. The time had come. Walter moved slowly, his joints aching more than usual, though he suspected it wasn't the cold. The old man dressed carefully thermal undershirt, his worn flannel coat, thick boots laced tight, and pulled a red cloth bracelet from the top drawer of his nightstand. It was faded, fraying at the edges, handmade by his late wife Helen decades ago, once worn by their son during camping trips. He had tied it around Ash's neck early on, a symbol of belonging, a tether between worlds. Ash sat on the porch as if he already knew. Walter crouched down, ran his hand gently down the bobcat's back. Ash did not flinch. Instead, he leaned slightly into the touch. His fur was thicker now, clean and glossy under the weak spring sunlight. Strong, ready. Walter stood and picked up the canvas shoulder bag he had packed the night before jerky, a folded blanket, and a slip of paper with a simple note. "Thank you for the days." It wasn't for Ash, not really, but for himself. Closure and writing. The two made their way down the mountain trail without words. It had been nearly a year since Walter first found the injured creature near the frozen stream. Now the trees were budding, the snow retreating to the higher peaks. The stream trickled gently, water dancing around rocks, like a song whispered only to those willing to listen. They reached the clearing where it had all begun. Walter stopped and knelt beside Ash, whose ears flicked, but who didn't move away. Slowly, Walter untied the red cloth from around Ash's neck. His hands shook not from age, but from the sheer emotional gravity of the moment. He placed the cloth on a nearby tree stump, gently smoothed it down. "I reckon this ain't goodbye," Walter whispered. "Just be safe out there." Ash blinked slowly, then turned his head toward the deeper woods. Walter didn't hug him. He didn't dare. But as he stood up and took a step back, Ash did something he had never done before. He walked forward, pressed the top of his head gently against Walter's knee, then sat a moment. Just one moment of stillness, of understanding. Then he turned and padded silently into the forest. Walter watched until the last glimpse of bobcat fur disappeared behind a cluster of spruce. He didn't cry right away. Not there. Not yet. Instead, he sat on the stump, next to the red cloth, listening to the wind rustle the high branches. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about Helen or Joshua or the firehouse. Just Ash. Just the sound of Paws moving freely over pine needles. The walk home felt longer. Each footstep echoed with the absence of a companion now gone. Walter reached the cabin near dusk and did not light the fire. He sat in the rocking chair, wrapped the unused blanket around his shoulders, and stared at the front door that Ash would no longer push open with his paw. Ruth came by 2 days later, basket of canned beans in one hand, a flask of apple brandy in the other. She knocked once, then walked in. "He's gone, isn't he?" she said quietly. Walter nodded. Ruth sat beside him without asking, poured them each a small glass. "He'll remember you. Wild things always do, in their own way." Walter didn't answer, but when he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper fragile, like dry leaves. "I thought letting go would break me." Ruth looked at him with a softness only someone who had lost much could offer. "Maybe it did, but sometimes breaking is how we make space for light." They sat together into the evening, sipping slowly, listening to the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The forest had reclaimed one of its own. But it had left something behind in Walter, not emptiness, but a quiet kind of fullness. A heart cracked open by love, stitched back together by wild grace. The seasons had cycled once more across the ridges of the San Juan Mountains. Snow came and went like breath, painting the peaks and then retreating again into the heavens. Walter Granger kept living as he always had in the quiet, in the rhythm of firewood and black coffee, in the creak of the old rocker by the hearth. But something had shifted. Since Ash's departure, a hush had settled in the cabin, deeper than silence, not empty, just unfinished. It was a late winter morning when the mail carrier, a young man named Cody Barnesfreckle, faced and broad-shouldered, always chewing sunflower seeds, noticed something off. Walter's mailbox hadn't been emptied in weeks. A man as punctual as a ticking clock, Walter never missed Tuesday mail. Cody made the hike up the icy path, his boots crunching into frozen earth, only to find the cabin dark, chimney cold, and no answer to his knock. He notified Ruth, who came at once, worry etched deep into her lined face. When the sheriff's deputy, quiet man named Tom Hadley, with salt and pepper hair and the gentlest gait in town, forced the door open, they found the cabin empty, but Walter's coat and axe were gone. The three of them followed a set of deep, frozen boot prints into the woods behind the cabin. It didn't take long to find him. Walter had collapsed near the fallen trunk of a pine, axe still in hand, as though he'd meant to finish the job and simply didn't. His expression was peaceful. A man returned to the earth on his own terms. The town of Ridgeway, small and close-knit, did what it always did when one of their own passed quiet dignity: a handmade pine casket, flowers from Ruth's front yard, and a modest gathering at the cemetery, nestled at the edge of the forest. The funeral was held under gray skies and soft drizzle, the kind of weather that seemed to hush the world. Mourners stood wrapped in scarves and memories. Ruth, of course, holding a folded flannel shirt she had washed and pressed one last time. Sheriff Hadley stood beside her. Cody Barnes, awkward in a stiff black jacket. Even Trina Caldwell came, her hat removed, eyes downcast. The Reverend, an elderly man named Pastor Henry, his voice gravelly from a lifetime of sermons, stood at the head of the casket, reading words of farewell. Walter Granger was a man of few words, but many acts. He knew pain, and he knew purpose. And though he lived apart from us, he never left our hearts. Just as the final prayer began, a ripple moved through the crowd, first a shift in posture, then gasps barely louder than breath. From the tree line behind the gravesite, a figure emerged. Gray fur, low shoulders, and eyes like winter fire. Ash. The Bobcat moved slowly, silently, his paws not making a sound on the damp earth. Not a soul moved, not even Cody. Ash approached the casket with a grace that seemed rehearsed by the universe itself. He paused at the side, lowered his head, and pressed his nose gently to the wooden surface just once. Then he curled up beside it, tail wrapping around his side, body still as stone. No one dared interrupt. The prayer finished. The drizzle fell. Ash remained. For the remainder of the service, he didn't move. And when the townspeople slowly began to leave some dabbing tears, others in stunned silence, Ash stayed. Only when the last human footstep faded did he rise, look toward the mountains, and walk back into the woods. But that would not be the end. Over the following weeks, Ruth would often see tracks paw prints around the cabin Walter once called home. Some days, she'd spot Ash lying on the wooden bench near the porch, where Walter used to sit with his coffee. He never stayed long, just long enough, as if waiting or remembering. Word spread across Ridgeway. Some said it was magic, others said it was instinct. Ruth didn't say anything at all, only placed a fresh bowl of water on the porch every few days, and once a slice of apple bread. The bench, the trail, and the stump, where Walter left the red cloth, eventually became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Children would come, whispering stories. Artists painted Ash. The town passed a vote to preserve the land around the cabin as Granger Grove, a protected refuge for wildlife and memory alike. Ash still came, even as the years wore on. And though no one knew exactly when he stopped or where he went, the paw prints remained etched into the hearts of those who remembered that bond. A man broken by loss, healed by a creature never meant to stay, and remembered by a world that often forgets the smallest miracles. Some bonds are not measured by time or words, but by presence, the quiet, unwavering kind that comes when two lost souls find healing in each other. Walter saved Ash with his hands, but Ash saved Walter with his silent companionship. And though their time together ended, the love they shared did not. It lingered in the trees, in the cabin, in the paw prints leading back home. Sometimes, the wildest things teach us the gentlest lessons: to love without expectation, to let go with grace, and to remember that no goodbye is ever truly final. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who needs a little light today. And if you haven't yet, tap that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story that might just stay with you forever.